Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. I welcome you all from whichever part of the world you are there. And at the very outset, I would like to thank all the media representatives from different parts of the world for getting healthcare at the center stage during this difficult time. All of us are going through the unprecedented situation impacting both lives and livelihood on because of COVID-19. It has impacted 185 million around the world, and it has taken the toll of 4 million people. During this difficult time, we at the pharmaceutical industry realized that our primary role is to ensure the consistent availability of medicines. We at IGBA used to meet periodically to ensure that we live up to the task and make sure that the medicines are available. At this particular moment, I'd like to thank the governments around the world, the medical profession, the ancillary industries, the logistic providers, patient groups for unstinted support during this time. And that has made possible that we have been able to supply the medicines around the world. Most of the time, we have been able to do this task, and the industry associations have played a very important role during this important time. Patient centricity is the hallmark of the generic and biosimilar industry. In fact, patient is the purpose of the existence of our industry. It is said by Adam that if you treat the disease, you treat only half and you win or you lose. But if you treat the patients, you are sure that the outcomes of health are better. And that is the primary goal of the IGBA, that we have to be patient focused, and all our industry members are highly patient focused. And the primary purpose of IGBA has been to improve the availability of quality, affordable medicines around the world. At this particular moment, IGBA leadership team sat down and said that we have to relook at the role of this industry, and we have to lay down a path for the future, because at the end of the day, how do we improve the patient outcomes, health outcomes, because that is the role of the industry. We have spent considerable period of time, the IGB leadership. We entered into conversation and gathered insight from industry captains around the world. We spent a lot of time with thought leaders, and IGB leadership team spent a lot of time. And this report is the outcome of intense discussion and outcome, and this report lays down the insights and creates the roadmap for the global generic and biosimilar industry. I'm sure all of you will find the deliberations today very insightful, and they will be thought builders on improving the healthcare outcomes for patients around the world. With this, I will request Hanan, our past chair, to discuss the structure of today's meeting. And I look forward once again and thank you for attending today's deliberation. Over to you, Hanan.
Thank you, Sudarshan. I'm happy to anchor the program of the press webinar today. Our program starts with an 8-minute presentation of the IGBA white paper on the vision for the global generic and biosimilar medicines industry, to be presented by Mr. Zed Cox, Secretary General of the IGBA. At 2:15, Mr. Sudarshan Jain, Mr. Zed Cox, and myself will officially release the vision report. Then we move on to a 25-minute panel discussion on global and regional perspectives on the generic and biosimilar medicines industry. This panel discussion will be followed by questions and answers session with the audience for 15 to 20 minutes. And we will end the webinar with the closing remarks by Ms. Cox and adjourn at 3 p.m. I am glad to introduce the panel moderator, Mr. David Wallace, Executive Editor of Informa Pharma Intelligence. And our panelists for today are Mr. Jonathan Kimball, Trade and International Affairs at Association for Accessible Medicines, USA. Mr. Sudarshan Jain, Secretary General of the Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance, India. And Mr. Adrian Vandenhoven, Director General of the Medicines for Europe. A brief bio of each of the moderator and the speakers were shared with the audience with the invite prior to the press webinar. If the audience have questions to the speakers, please submit them during the webinar into the questions and answers box. Finally, please note that the webinar will be recorded, and we will share the link of the recording via email with the audience after the webinar. With that, I hand over to you, Suzette.
Thank you. Oh, it did not stay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hanan. It just went on and off. I'm sharing the screen now. So, dear participants, let me guide you through the 4 chapters of the white paper. The first chapter deals with the significant contribution of the generic and biosimilar medicines industry. The second chapter covers the opportunities, challenges, and disruptions. The third one, of course, we will present the proposed vision for the generic and biosimilar medicines industry built around 4 pillars. And then at the end, the actions and the support needed to achieve this vision. The chapter of the contribution is a very important one, since we believe that the importance and the impact of this industry is still not fully understood everywhere, despite the fact that it has massively enhanced patient access globally and is therefore a strong contributor to global health outcomes. Without this industry, you cannot serve the healthcare needs of the global population. This has been largely exemplified during the pandemic. The industry is also a key source for healthcare savings, thereby supporting the sustainability of the healthcare systems, and it drives significant economic benefit through employment and macroeconomic impacts like trade. In order to able to shape the growth of this industry, 6 key tailwinds and opportunities have been identified. The first one, of course, we all know the underlying socioeconomic fundamentals like sustained growth in population across the world, faster growth of the aging population, and chronic diseases and conditions on the rise in all regions of the world. Regarding the innovation pipeline, it is rich, both for small molecules and more complex large molecules. Then we have the biosimilar space. Biosimilar companies have invested a long time, and we are seeing now finally increasing use of biosimilars also outside Europe. Then there is the digital development. There is a strong digital wave accelerated by the pandemic. Then we have the continuous innovation. Generic companies continue to develop so-called value-added medicines, despite the ever-rising bar of what is considered innovation. And then there are new opportunities. Beyond the traditional generics and biosimilars offerings, industry is exploring new opportunities to enhance access to patients, like consumer healthcare, digital therapeutics, and contact development and manufacturing. Regarding the challenges, we have identified 6 key headwinds and disruptions which the industry is facing. The well-known one is the sustained price pressure from regulators and customers. If not managed carefully, this could lead to significant negative impact on availability and access of critical products. Then we have the regulatory hurdles. Regulatory convergence, it's still in its infancy, too much duplications and lack of regulatory harmonization and reliance. There is progress, but when we look, for example, at the regulatory framework for global development for complex generic, it is emerging only very slowly. Then we have, of course, the global supply chain, which was clearly a lot discussed over the past 1.5 years. The pandemic has revealed the sensitivity and the vulnerability of the global manufacturing and supply networks. And with regard to the pipeline, the innovative pipeline, of course, I mentioned before that it's rich, but at the same time, the flip side of it is that there are new modalities and technologies in the innovation pipeline, and that increase the risk profile of investments for the generic and biosimilar medicines industry. Then we have the emerging markets. Well, you could say this is part of the headwinds, the tailwinds, sorry, but nevertheless, the emerging markets continue to be quite challenging. And then we have the commercial models. They are changing and pressure the industry margins. In light of these opposing forces, industry would need to work towards an integrated 2030 vision built around 4 pillars. And let me go through those. The first pillar is expand patient access to high quality and affordable medicines across traditional and emerging modalities. Second pillar, step up to become a confident, well-respected strategic partner to institutions globally. Third pillar, broaden the role to help form end-to-end healthcare ecosystems along the entire continuum of care. And the last pillar, enable sustained economic contribution for economies, healthcare system, and all stakeholders. To help industry to achieve its vision, it should consider to focus on 7 key imperatives. First one is, of course, the supply chain. Companies should consider their supply chain in light of the vulnerabilities highlighted by the pandemic. Then we have the portfolio. Today, 30 to 45% of the products in the pipeline are complex versus less than 20% 5 years ago. A sharp portfolio selection is therefore needed. On the commercial side, a mixture of physical and digital models may become the future norm. With regard to digital, which has already been mentioned several times, it is becoming imperative to embed digital across the entire supply chain. Then again, with regard to the core activities, companies should consider to strike a careful balance between focusing on their core activities and new focus areas such as consumer health and digital therapeutics. In addition, given the increasing complexity of generic and biosimilar development, manufacturing and commercialization, the industry will increasingly shift from doing it all alone to building a network of partnership. And last but not least, the industry should consider agility and new capabilities while welcoming post-pandemic working models. But industry cannot do this alone. It needs strong support from regulators, government, and association in key areas to achieve this vision. There is a need for an efficient and consistent regulatory compliance framework, an equitable patent and litigation system fostering innovation while enabling access, open international borders and secure trade flows, and a healthy reward for innovation. So this was the white paper in a nutshell. A more detailed synthesis is available via our website from today onwards, but also you can find it in the invite you received for the webinar. And I'm closing this presentation now, and then I invite the IBGH chair, Surashan Jain and immediate past chair Hannanspool to officially release the 2030 Vision White Paper. Thank you. Let me first stop sharing. There you go. Thank you. And I hand over to our moderator, David Wallace. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Suzette. It's a pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel today for such a significant launch. And obviously, there's a huge amount to unpack in the white paper, but I wondered whether I might start with maybe inevitably the questions linked to COVID and the experiences over the last year and a half. And the white paper highlights how that has really, the off-patent industry has really played a crucial role in the pandemic. I wondered whether, Sudarshan, you could maybe start with talking about how the pandemic has reshaped our understanding of the generics and biosimilar supply chain.
Thank you very much, Dave, for this very insightful questions. Like last 18 months have been very, very important for all of us. And we said that we were not very sure, how do we make sure that supply of medicines is there? One of the important things is I've never seen this kind of collaboration between government, companies which are competitors, they coming together, industry, all the industry associations coming together, ancillary industries coming together, and making sure that patient is the center of everything and we make products available. I'll give you a lot of examples, like say logistics service providers or say channel members. They were there to make sure that the medicines are available for the patient. The workers have been there in the factories to make the production available. And that was very important that during this time, we got the importance of safety of employees, which became the highest priority. So one of the big three, some of the learnings of this pandemic is collaboration is important because at the end of the day, patient is the center of everything what we do. And hence everyone has to collaborate and patient becomes supreme to make the medicines available. Point number one. Point number two is that each one should work together. And in this difficult time, like say channel partners and all those, they become important. And the safety of the employees, that become very important. And the third part which became very important is digitalization. In the first 3 months, whatever digitalization took place, in fact, in many of the industries, what we are talking about is what we planned by 2025, we have been able to do it in first 6 months. So that has been the reshaping of the industry. So these are the three important variables which got into the whole thing. And last point is the regulatory. Many of the regulatory authorities responded for emergency use authorizations with the medicines during this time. I will stop here and then build upon it.
Yeah, I just wondered whether, talking a little bit about the vulnerabilities of the supply chain that have maybe been highlighted in the last year and a half, we've seen governments move towards strengthening their efforts to build local manufacturing capacity. I wonder whether you could talk about this from the Indian perspective and then maybe Adrian and Jonathan from the European and US perspectives as well.
It is very, very important because during the pandemic time, the issue which was raised is, should everyone start producing the products in their own markets? And should the local country patients are more important than anywhere else? So there were restrictions which are imposed in some parts of the world. However, it is important that we need to realize is based on the theory of competitive advantage that you can't produce everything in every part of the world. It will raise the healthcare cost. And what is important is the diversified supply chain. There should not be one supplier for the product. The product should be available from multiple places, so the dependability from one source gets reduced. Hence, it is not localization from supply chain which is important. It is the diversified supply chain which is very important. And that is our position as far as India is concerned. And I believe.
And in the EU and the US, is there a similar viewpoint on that?
Yeah, hi Dave. This is for Europe. I think indeed, obviously, as Sudarshan pointed out, we had immediately huge surges in demand for certain medicines due to COVID, and I think the industry reacted very well. Indeed, there was a lot of collaboration between the industry and governments, around things like regulatory flexibility and things like that. But there was also a huge amount of international cooperation between us through the IGBA and with the WHO as, I guess, the kind of international regulator where we pursued similar initiatives. So I think that actually worked very well because although we had a lot of surges, in almost all cases, our industry was able to respond, even in cases where we thought at the beginning we would not be able to. We're able through these processes, let's say, to meet those massive surges. Just to give an indication, okay, for some drugs, the increase in demand was 900%. That's 9 times the normal demand, okay? That's not something that you have lying around in stockpiles, let's say in wholesalers or what have you. You have to produce this. So I think that that's key. Going forward, I agree with Sudarshan. I don't think it makes sense for any country or any region, if you wish, to try and produce absolutely everything. What we can do to increase diversity of production, of course, makes a lot of sense. And I think here we're seeing this. So there's been a certain rebound of manufacturing here in Europe. There's an interesting discussion between our industry and the European Union about how to kind of encourage that going forward. I think one of the key things to underline here is that a lot of governments think that by snapping their fingers, this is going to happen, when in reality, this will all require investment by the private sector. Even where there is some support for technology or this kind of thing from government programs, the overwhelming majority of the investment is going to have to come from the private sector. And for the generic industry, for our industry, I mean, the real challenge is that the markets are currently designed to drive prices as low as they possibly can go. And of course, that's not compatible with a diversity model. So I think we have to have sustainable market models that encourage those investments in greater diversity. And I hope closer cooperation. I think certainly for IGBA, and Jonathan will talk more about that, we're looking at a future world where we can cooperate more, EU, US, India, and all the members of the IGBA to ensure good trade flows, even in crisis situations. I'll stop there.
And from the US perspective, I think the debate has definitely evolved. Last spring, you saw a lot of discussions, on really both sides of the political aisle, Republicans and Democrats, who are thinking, could we bring back all pharmaceutical manufacturing to the United States? Clearly, that was not a realistic debate and discussion. And I think we've evolved to a place where there's a real recognition, again, from the Republicans and Democratic parties, that we operate in a globalized world and our pharmaceutical supply chain in the United States is most secure when we're relying and partnering with our allies for that globally diversified supply chain. And so even in the Biden administration's report that came out last month, looking at the sustainability of the pharmaceutical supply chains in the United States for both finished dosage and API, they identified ensuring that our allies have resilient supply chains as a key policy objective for the Biden administration. So I think that globally diverse supply chain, there is recognition of the value of that. And not only by government, but I also think truthfully by our industry as well. In one sense, the tension that Adrian identified is real. I mean, the market drives prices down, but at the same time, there is increased market demand for what is viewed as a diversified, secured supply chain. And so how that gets worked out in the end through both government interaction, as well as if there's a way that some private sector actors are going to increase the value they place in that diversified supply chain, I think will play instrumental in how this works out in the end. But the market dynamics right now and putting pressure on bringing the lowest price for particular commoditized generic products into the marketplace makes it very difficult to have this diverse supply chain, as Adrian again had pointed out.
Yeah, now Adrian mentioned there the regulatory flexibilities that we've seen brought in since the start of the pandemic. I wondered whether these are flexibilities that we think could be extended and could perhaps represent long-term solutions for the industry, even outside of the context of the pandemic.
Yeah, Dave, maybe I can start off on that one. So I think there were some measures that were kind of emergency measures that exist in most regulatory systems, like things like temporary imports or re-importing what had been exported, which normally you cannot do very easily, but this was made more flexible. I think the other things that could be considered, I think there was a greater use of digital tools for regulation. Just to give an example, we had a lot of used for narcotics, like fentanyl and this kind of thing during the crisis, to import or export, even between European countries. Okay, so let's say between Germany and France, but also, of course, obviously between, say, India or the US and Europe. You need a special import-export license, and normally this is a paper license that you need to obtain, signed by an authority. And of course, this was difficult during the pandemic because everybody was in lockdown. Rather quickly and efficiently, the UN agency responsible for this was able to help us and help the regulators move to a digital format for this process. And of course, that was absolutely necessary, and it enabled the continued flow of this very critical product during the pandemic, to be able to flow across borders. But there are many other good examples of that going forward. And I think from our perspective, to the extent that we can implement more digital tools to continue high standard regulation, but much more efficient in terms of allocation, so the movement of product across countries, that will benefit the industry significantly. But more importantly, it will reduce the risks of localized stockouts in certain countries. You'll be able to move products much faster. And I'd say that's for the global world, but also inside the European Union. So we still don't have it perfect even within what is considered to be a single market, which is the EU.
And on the point about digitalization more broadly, thinking of it in the context of innovation, the white paper mentions the headwinds and disruptions that are coming from new modalities and technologies. I wondered, how is the off-patent industry providing innovation around off-patent medicines? And is this something that can be enhanced in future?
So basically building on the theme, Dave, and also what Adrian was speaking earlier, digitalization use has been there all over in the industry, whether it is regulatory approvals, documents, signatures. Like I remember we used to move to the regulatory offices all around, get their personal signature, make those things happen. And they were responding very fast for the approvals. There can be more talk because you are on the webinars, you can have regular conversations. They were responding very fast. So that was external collaboration, which was possible because of the newer technology and the reliance on that technology during COVID times. I don't think it could have happened earlier with regulatory authorities that you speak on the webinar, they sign it and get going with it. But this was possible. Secondly, internally also, there has been a lot of use of digitalization. Like the quality control person has to be on the shop floor. It is not required today because there has been integration of all the systems, SOP systems around the country, around the company. So whether it is quality control systems, whether it is sales and operation planning system, whether it is demand system, or whether it is clinical trial systems, we have been using a lot of digitalization and anticipating the patient needs, clinical trials, and getting going forward. So we will see introduction of digitalization across all the operations of the company, both internally and externally.
And again, in the realm of innovation and I suppose future pipelines, an open question really, is there a healthy, sufficient LOE pipeline for generics and biosimilars looking ahead?
Maybe I can begin on this. There are many products which are going out of patent. So a lot of clinical development work which is taking place as far as that pipeline is coming in. There is a lot of work which has been done on biosimilars, which is a big opportunity. A lot of work which is happening by the generic industry in that space. And there will be a lot of work which will also happen in the value-added space. And this is because of the pandemic and then there is a lot of work which is happening in the repurposed drug because large manufacturing capacity exists around the world. And many of the repurposed drug use because they are safe, they have been used as far as COVID pandemic is concerned. So we will see a lot of change and the concept of repurposed drug perhaps emerged during the pandemic time.
Yeah, maybe I can add to what Sudarshan has said, David. I think one of the things that you will see is that there'll be fewer of the classical kind of retail or community pharmacy generics coming to the market and more generic, biosimilar, value-added type products coming to specialty kind of therapy areas. And this is because, of course, this is where the expiries are taking place. Now, the benefit here is potentially huge in terms of patient access, because often these specialty therapies are more expensive because there are fewer patients, and so therefore there's a kind of higher unit cost there. So the difference that our industry can make is absolutely massive. And we saw that with biosimilars, what kind of a difference that now, it's expected over the next 5 years that biosimilars will have an equivalent effect in Europe to generic launches in terms of, let's say, better access, lower costs, etc. The challenge I think that we face is not so much that we can help patients, we certainly can do so. I think that governments will struggle in this area to understand and to manage this process. So we have seen with biosimilars how difficult it has been to convince governments to stimulate competition in biosimilars, including in Europe, which invented biosimilars, right? So we claim we're so far ahead, but it took us many, many years in Europe to get where we were, because as Sudarshan said, we had to convince governments to take a patient-centric approach to biosimilars to get them to be accepted, to get that competition in the market. Without that patient-centric benefit sharing approach, we were not successful at bringing competition. We needed governments to change their mindset to a patient-centric approach, as Sudarshan has stated earlier. I think looking forward, whether it's for specialty generics or value-added medicines, it's a little bit the same thing. To bring competition to these markets is more complex, and you need to bring a patient-centric, benefit-sharing type approach, looking at our industry as kind of a service provider to healthcare to enable that competition and to bring huge, huge benefits. Just think of value-added medicines, what we could do to better manage chronic diseases and the efficiency gains and the improvements for patients in that space. The difficulty is we need to change the mindsets of governments from seeing generics just as a savings tool per unit. How many X percentage savings can I get per unit on this, to looking at us as a service provider to healthcare, to improving access and improving the treatment of patients overall.
I can just
sorry, Jonathan, go ahead.
Just a point, because to build on what Adrian had said, one of the challenges for the industry when you're looking at complex generics or biosimilars, and the difficulty of the pathway that Adrian described, is the risk profile for those products increases dramatically. You've got much smaller patient populations that you need to build out, and the clinical trial, the data for bringing that product to the market. You have fewer patients to sell into, and in a system that isn't predictable about how you're actually going to enter that market. And that gets very complicated in the US perspective when you're talking about biosimilars and the uncertainty around the patenting system there. So I think it is a challenge for our industry as we look forward about what type of products and what the portfolio of the companies will be, as more and more of the products in the marketplace, especially when you're looking at in terms of dollars terms and value, are going to be taken up by these complex products. And so how the industry is going to work with those products losing their exclusivity will be a challenge, but it's one that the governments are going to have to address, because that's where they're spending more and more of their healthcare resources on those complex products.
Dave, just to build on this point is what Adrian and Jonathan have just talked about. It will be great to look at HIV story from 2000 to 2019. At that time, no one could have imagined the difference the generic industry will make. In fact, if we look at the data, there are 15 million lives which have been saved in the period 2000 to 2019, 51% reduction in fatalities. And the role of patient centricity is so fundamental that we have made difference to the healthcare outcomes. And biosimilars, again, that will be the role this industry will be playing, as highlighted by Adrian.
Yes, and I was just thinking, growing out of that thought about recognizing the value of the industry, I wanted to move on to price erosion, which is obviously mentioned in the white paper as one of the key headwinds for the industry. I have a couple of linked questions, really. I think the first one is, what are the trends that we're seeing at the moment, and do they allow the industry to remain sustainable? And the second one is really whether the value beyond cost is being recognized, I'm thinking particularly in terms of non-price factors in procurement decisions. I wonder whether, Adrian, you've got comments on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So it flows on from the previous points. Look, we understand that healthcare insurers, whether they're public or private, they're looking to get a fair deal and to treat their patients efficiently from a cost perspective. And you know, our industry is the only healthcare industry that contributes to that in any material way. And you know, you can look at any statistics in any country to see the difference our industry makes, and you will see a dramatic contribution to efficiency, to cost efficiency. I think the challenge we face is that a lot of payers and health ministries, what they are in a way obsessed with is the lowest unit price of any molecule, and they want to get the lowest unit price in Europe or in the world or what have you. And you know, to a certain extent, you see it even in the private markets. For example, in the U.S., similar phenomena occurring. And I think, you know, this is simply incompatible with sustainability of the industry. We cannot invest in this kind of framework. If governments and payers would look at this as a system, what are the kind of cost efficiencies that our industry as a whole can bring to the system to enable, you know, sustainability for health insurers, public or private? There you totally change the dynamic, and our industry can still bring massive contributions. We talk about biosimilars, we talk about complex products, we talk about value-added medicines that are an inexpensive form of innovation that can help with a lot of the costs and the challenges for patients associated with chronic diseases or even infectious diseases to a certain extent. Repurposing, Sudarshan has mentioned, is a cost-effective investment for innovation. You know, we can change the dynamics. Evergreening, if we put an end to the worst evergreening process, you know, we can save almost the equivalent, you know, of the generic market in savings. So, you know, there's a lot that can be done if we look at this as a system, and our industry, it will be the major contributor. But if we look at it at the unit price of each molecule, how can I get to the bottom as soon as possible? You know, that leads to withdrawals. A study commissioned by the European Commission on the root causes of shortages has looked at this, and they've noticed that almost all withdrawals of medicines, often generic medicines, occur when they are at a marginal sales level of 100,000 euros a year. At that point, the product is just withdrawn, and permanently, meaning there's no more access to that molecule in Europe or in that country any longer. You know, so this obsession with pushing the prices, unit prices lower and lower is a recipe for disaster. On the other hand, a systemic approach focused on patients, you know, this industry can and will deliver.
If I can link this back to the supply chain discussion you raised in the first question, because in the United States, we, for the first time ever last October, published our list of essential medicines. And when you look at that list of essential medicines, those that are most critical for in a health emergency and for the US healthcare system, those are the products that tend to be high volume, low price products. And so the exact medicines that the US would like to see manufactured in the United States, and that's what they're basing that kind of the broader goal of US produced products, those are the same products where prices have eroded to such a degree that you're seeing shortages in the marketplace for the reasons that Adrian had identified. And so it's not an issue of, does the company want to produce those products? It's with the price where they're eroded down to, is it actually feasible for them to manufacture for certain products in certain markets? Now, I misspoke a little. Those products, our companies have been able to keep those products in the marketplace, but when you correlate that to the FDA shortage list, you'll see the prices on those essential medicines where they've eroded are the ones that appear on that list.
I'm conscious of time and I want to make sure that we leave time for Q&A later, but I did want to ask a couple of questions about biosimilars also. I wondered whether the recent advances that we've seen, particularly in oncology biosimilars, whether they maybe help to show a way forward for biosimilars. And I also wanted to ask whether major markets are sufficiently incentivizing the uptake of biosimilars. And that's an open question for all regions.
Yeah, so I can speak maybe for Europe. I think you know, we were surprised actually by the speed of uptake in oncology. So oncologists embraced biosimilars very, very rapidly, and I think this may be linked to an understanding of oncologists that they're struggling to get payers or insurers to reimburse other expensive innovation, because most of the innovation is in oncology, and there are restrictions, at least in Europe, on this. So maybe this economic understanding, drove them to really have a high degree of trust. The oncologists also said that they saw the positive experience with infliximab, obviously not used in oncology, and they were convinced that this was the way forward. So I do think that this is making advances. I think where some challenges still occur is stimulating competition in community pharmacy or retail distribution of biosimilars is a little bit more complex. It's not that much more complex. You just have to look at how the benefit sharing models fit into that kind of context, and you can work out a very similar approach to stimulate competition. At least that's for Europe. It's usually because the benefit sharing policies are not in place in the community pharmacy setting yet.
In the United States, I think we've finally seen the biosimilars market begin to take off. It was fairly stagnant for some time. But one of the real challenges that still exists in the US biosimilar market relates to patent thickets and the increased use of innovative or biologic producers and leveraging as many patents as possible to forestall the competition from biosimilars. I mean, take example, Keytruda. There's a study by IMAC that recently came out where they showed that Merck had filed 129 patent applications in the US for Keytruda, and he granted 86 patents. Now, the challenge there is, in a sense, if you're a biosimilar producer, you have to feel confident that you're going to get, if you litigate those patents, that you're going to be 100% successful. And for the originator company, for the biologic producer, they just have to be successful on one of those patents to forestall that market entry. So it still is a very challenging environment for bringing biosimilar competition into the United States, but we're seeing the trajectory is definitely improving, and you're seeing greater comfort level in the prescribers, but through the physicians. And so we expect, and I think people are predicting, that market in the US to finally begin to take off.
I will talk from the India's development point of view, because Indian industry has played a very important role in generic industry. Many of the companies are taking a lead in the development of biosimilars. The investments are high, development of biosimilars, and critical area is the clarity on the pathway for approvals. That will become very, very important. And second realization which has to be there is, it is not only the cost. Overall education in biosimilars is very, very important. The reach to the doctors, education, awareness. Because if we start looking only at the cost part of biosimilars, that will not help to build the market. Because reach also requires education. Reach requires awareness. And that is the role which has to be recognized of the generic and biosimilar industry. Because again, the patient, just by launching the product, it will not make the difference. The role which this industry plays, which Adrian highlighted and Jonathan highlighted, that creating awareness for biosimilars, that will be very, very important.
And one final question on biosimilars before we move on to the Q&A. And if people do want to submit questions, they can do that in the Q&A box. And if they could leave their name, their organisation and their region, that would be really helpful. But just before we move on to the Q&A, a final question on tailoring clinical requirements for biosimilars and biosimilar registration pathways. We've obviously seen a new pathway in the UK, which won't require clinical efficacy data where that's justified. And I wondered whether that could be a potential model for other regions to follow, and what the thinking was at the moment on that.
Yeah, from my side, Dave, so I think indeed this industry has been supportive of that, based first and foremost on the science. So I think the experience with the regulatory approvals of biosimilar medicines has demonstrated that the analytical data was more than sufficient in most cases to justify the regulatory approval, and that the additional clinical data, which was just confirmatory, didn't bring a huge amount of additional evidence or information. So this really makes sense to look at this from a scientific point of view and to evolve in this direction. This is also ethical, because you normally don't do clinical studies where you know in advance what the result would be. And so I would say this makes a lot of sense. There's more to it than that. However, there's also an international and global cooperation, which is that there can be efforts, and the WHO is already taking some areas, some work on in this field to work together to reduce the duplication of clinical and other requirements across jurisdictions. So there have been some efforts between the EU and the US, say the EMA and the US FDA, in this regard, to advance more quickly and more efficiently development for both markets, but we're not there yet. And I think we could do a lot there as well in terms of greater cooperation across jurisdictions. Governments want, cost competitiveness. We agree with that. But then we also need a regulatory system with high scientific standards, of course, but one which is also more efficient than the current approaches.
As I say, conscious of time, I'm going to move on to the Q&A now. We've had a couple of questions in already. I'd like to start with an initial question that we've had from Helen Collis at Politico in the UK. And the question is that there's been a lot of talk recently on the need for reshoring pharmaceutical manufacturing and processes. Do you think we will see a shift in Europe towards less reliance on China and India, for example, for APIs and generics in the coming years? And what effect will this have on the sector in Europe and globally? It's a question for everyone, I suppose, that one.
Yeah, so indeed, there's a lot of kind of political hype around this discussion in Europe, especially since the pandemic. And indeed, there seems to be an evolution towards encouraging greater diversity and investment in manufacturing inside Europe itself. So just to highlight, Europe is still a huge manufacturer of both active pharmaceutical ingredient and finished dosage forms, so medicines, if you wish, including generic API and generic finished dosage form medicines. But the reality is that China and India have grown much, much faster over the last 10 years than European manufacturers of either API or finished dosage form. So it's true that the growth has been more on the Asian side. I think that will evolve. So there are a couple of things that are positive in Europe. First of all, we introduced something called the SPC manufacturing waiver. It doesn't come into force until July 2022, so we will only feel its effects in 2022. But that will have a positive impact on manufacturing in Europe. The second thing is the European Union is looking at encouraging more FDF and active pharmaceutical ingredients production in Europe. So it's not against India or against China, but it's really about improving the technologies to green the production, to digitize the production processes, this kind of thing. And I think that's advancing well. The only problem, so probably our industry is ranked third in terms of priority industries in the EU Recovery Fund, which is a 750 billion euro fund. So we're ranked third after electric cars and kind of greening the electricity grid. This kind of things are higher priority than we are, but we're somehow ranked third. The difficulty we're facing is that most of the production sites of medicines and API in Europe are located in big cities or around big cities and industrial parks. And so therefore this clashes with EU state aid and regional aid rules. So when we apply for these funds, because most of our production sites are located in and around big cities, then it's difficult for us to qualify. So we're working with the EU to try and get some clarity on how the recovery funds can actually apply in practice to medicines and API production in Europe. That said, I think we will continue to work with international trade partners, including our colleagues on the call here, because not only do we import a lot of API and generic medicines, we export a lot of API and generic medicines. So, there is actually more of a balance than is often said in the media. But I am confident that we will move forward and we will see more investment in production in Europe.
And Jonathan, is there anything to add there from the US perspective?
I think similar. There's a lot of attention being paid to this by Congress as well as the White House. There's a lot of resources being put behind, a lot of proposals being sort of promulgated that would seek to create incentives for more investment in the United States in the pharmaceutical sector. We at AAM have our own blueprint to enhance the security of the US pharmaceutical sector, which identifies a range of incentives. I think key, as I mentioned earlier, is this greater recognition of that there has to be cooperation among allies and partners. And as Adrian said, India, the United States, many other countries would be part of that, to ensure that there's coordination and cooperation in the supply chains. We've actually, again, have proposed the idea of an international pharmaceutical supply chain agreement where Governments would come together to ensure that they're sharing information. There's greater transparency in what is being produced in their markets. There's greater coordination to ensure that there are no major disruptions in the supply chain. And so we would like to see so that type of agreement advance, where there can be predictability, there can be networks put in place and avenues where governments can ensure that they have the ability to coordinate and cooperate in terms of promoting that type of supply chain security.
Sudarshan, what's the perspective on this from the Indian industry?
So basically, Dave, the point which Adrian as well as Jonathan said, there are two sides of the same coin. One is the import dependence and export vulnerabilities. And the simple economic sense says that we should get the best leverage of technology in production. And if that balance exists, the resilient, diversified supply chain is very important. And we should keep that in mind and pursue wherever we get the best value for patient. That should be the path pursued. And then there should be free trade agreements and bilateral relationship, which helps you to ensure supplies to the patient.
I'm going to move on now to another question that we've had from Tony Hagen from the Center of Biosimilars in the US. The question is that when it comes to biosimilar use, Europe is ahead of the US. And what advice do the panelists have for the US about getting biosimilars into wider circulation?
Yeah, I think a lot of people thought just because biosimilars have a lower price that they're going to be automatically, embraced and used by physicians and patients. I think the European experience, but I think all of my colleagues have been through the same thing. The reality is that it's not that way. So first of all, patients and physicians, they demanded information and education about biosimilars, about the regulatory process, which was something new because they've never requested that for originator drugs. So they've never asked about how an originator drug is approved, but they did ask for it for biosimilars. So and that's a pretty tall exercise. We embraced it and we pursued it. And I think, there are a lot of education materials are now available everywhere. In Europe, we have it in every single language. But I know my colleagues have done the same in their own jurisdiction. So that was step one. Step two, whether it's in procurement or in kind of reimbursement or insurance markets, you need to have a system that stimulates competition, that encourages physicians to prescribe biosimilars and to be able to switch the medicine, so to switch from the reference product to the biosimilar. Otherwise, you won't get competition in the market. And for this, you need different benefit sharing models in procurement or in insurance reimbursement, what have you, to enable that to happen. It doesn't happen on its own. And the difficulty I think that people face is that you need the payers or the Ministry of Health or whoever's in charge to actually introduce those changes. And they're taken by surprise because they say, well, this should just look like generics, and it doesn't. So you need to have a different model there. But once you do it, the benefits are massive. I can just give an indication. In the UK, for rheumatoid arthritis, they've just changed the NICE guidelines, which basically determines whether a medicine will be reimbursed or not. And the potential patient population with rheumatoid arthritis who now can be treated with biologics thanks to biosimilar competition has almost doubled. Now, I'm not saying that in practice will have a doubling of the population, but the population that has access now has doubled. And this is in the UK, not the poorest country in Europe. Imagine the differences we can make in poorer countries than that. So this is really, really a game changer in terms of improved health.
I'm going to pull another question from the Q&A box here. This is an anonymous question, but it's on the subject of digital. And it says, could the panel be more specific on what solutions they believe the generics and biosimilars industry needs to adopt? Is it an R&D, digital medicines, diagnostics, disease management, delivery of care, supply chain management? So the question of digital there, what are the specific solutions that the industry could adopt?
Maybe, Dave, I can start with, say, teleconsulting. It is a big thing which is happening. Say, there are many markets of the world where the doctor-patient population is limited. So patient can reach to the doctors, and then there is availability of medicines. So if we reach to the better healthcare outcomes, which will happen, then the phygital model, what we are talking, the commercial sense, like there is no, the rep interaction with the doctor is getting reduced. And how do you deliver the scientific information to the doctors? Again, digital is playing a very important role in the commercial model. If you see manufacturing, automation is going up. We are talking in some parts of the world is continuous manufacturing, digitalization of the whole process. That is making a difference. And those are special things which are happening. We couldn't have produced the kind of production what we have unless we have increased digitalization. And I'm aware of many of the companies which have done it. Supply chain operation. We have got integrated supply chain operations right from demand forecasting, production, procurement, and that has been played by digital. And even the quality control, clinical trials, everywhere digital is playing an important role. I'll stop here.
Yeah, from our side, I would say it's the same. So I'd say the two big areas, but there are many areas where this can have an impact. One is in supply chain, and the other is in improving disease management. So I think those are the two areas where really our industry can make a massive difference. So in terms of supply chains, the supply chains of most of our companies are already digitalized. But the main challenge that we face, and we had this problem during the COVID pandemic where we did this project on ICU medicines because there were these huge demand surges, is that the demand or the market is not digitalized at all. I mean, zero digitalization. So we were calculating how much we could produce, but we couldn't get from any country in Europe what the demand was. So we had to set up a project where we calculated the demand, and we're not epidemiologists, so we had to do the demand calculation because we just have zero digitalization. Most hospitals in Europe do not digitalize drug supply, even though they are the biggest consumers, of course, of drugs. And so there's a huge mismatch there, and we need to work, and we are proposing to work with governments to help them to digitalize what I would say the kind of demand side, because we can produce as much as we can, but if we don't know what the real demand is, we'll never get anywhere. So I think that's supply chain issue. There are also some small things where we can make differences with things like digital leaflets. So I think, as you know, in Europe, we speak 23 different languages, and Europeans don't stay put. So they go on vacation, usually in different countries. Well, they can't read any leaflets. And unfortunately, they often get sick when they travel. And so we are really pushing for more access to digital leaflets so that patients can have the drug in their own language, so they can understand what they're doing with the drug, and that's something very important. I think on the disease management side, it's quite well noted that for both chronic diseases and many issues around AMR like sepsis, healthcare practitioners, our healthcare systems are struggling, meaning the disease management for most chronic diseases is quite poor, whether it's adherence or lack of compliance or various things like this. And there, people often say, oh yeah, they blame the patient, it's the patient's fault. Usually it's not. Usually there's something triggering why the patient is not doing this. We can figure out what it is and fix it. Is it because they're gagging on the drug, so it's the taste of the drug? Is it because they need to be reminded when to take the drug? And we can do a lot of things, whether it's reformulation, whether it's digital, to try and fix those problems and help the patients, because they have genuine reasons why. Like, just blaming the patients is not the solution.
Yeah.
But there are also things like sepsis. Sepsis is a very deadly disease. And there it's just a question of timing, how quickly you get the products to the patients, how quickly you can diagnose it. And with digital and reformulated products, which we have in our pipeline, which we sell outside of Europe, we could reduce a lot of the problems with, say, sepsis, for example.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to jump in there because I see that we're up to time, but I'd like to thank all the panelists for what I think has been a very interesting discussion and has covered a lot of ground. And I'd like to hand back to Suzette now to close.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you for the very interesting exchange. I hope you got a lot out of it. Let me just summarize our paper. the 2000 vision postulated is an attempt to lay down a common North Star for the industry participants, as well as all its stakeholders, as they collectively look towards shaping the next horizon of the industry. Achieving this vision will require concerted actions from the industry participants, and support from all stakeholders will be critical to support the industry in this journey. By addressing the imperatives suggested, the industry and its stakeholders will further advance the contribution of the generic and biosimilar medicines in the future, benefiting patients and healthcare systems globally. I hereby thank the panelists, the moderator, as well as all the participants, and also the questions which were raised in advance or during the seminar. So this white paper is also an invitation to dialogue. So please stay in touch. You have now our emails. We are happy to stay connected. And I thank you and say you bye-bye.